The desert stretched endlessly under the inky black sky, a barren wasteland punctuated by the occasional scrubby bush or twisted Joshua tree. The road ahead was a ribbon of asphalt, illuminated only by the dim headlights of a beat-up, dust-covered car. Inside, the driver's hands gripped the wheel firmly, his knuckles white against the leather, as he sped through the desert night. The engine hummed, the tires thrummed against the cracked road, and the only sound inside the vehicle was the steady hiss of the air conditioner working overtime to fight off the oppressive desert heat. His name was Carter, and though anyone looking at him from a distance might have seen an ordinary man, the truth was far darker. Beneath his calm exterior, there was something rotten, something festering, a sickness that had taken hold of him long ago and never let go. Carter was a killer, and the desert was his hunting ground. He didn't know why he had chosen this life. He didn't bother with questions like that anymore. It was simply what he did, what he was out here in the silence of the open road. No one could hear the screams. No one could stop him. He had left a trail of bodies across 3 states, and he wasn't done yet. Not by a long shot. Tonight, though, something felt different. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched, though there was no one for miles. The night pressed in on him, thick and heavy, like a weight on his chest. He tried to shake it off, focusing instead on the road ahead, the distant horizon that seemed to shimmer under the glow of the moon. Then he saw him, a lone figure, standing on the side of the road, his thumb outstretched, illuminated briefly in the headlights before fading into the darkness behind the car. Carter's heart skipped a beat. A hitchhiker, out here in the middle of nowhere? It seemed too perfect, too easy. He could feel the familiar thrill of anticipation stirring in his gut. He pressed down on the brake, slowing the car to a stop a few yards ahead. In the rearview mirror, the figure began to jog toward the car, silhouetted against the faint light of the moon. Carter's pulse quickened as the man approached the passenger door and pulled it open. "You going far?" the hitchhiker asked, his voice low and raspy from what Carter assumed was hours of walking in the desert heat. The man was tall, with dark, unkempt hair and a scruffy beard. He looked rough, like someone who had been out here for a long time, worn down by the elements. "Depends," Carter replied, his voice calm, betraying none of the excitement he felt. "Where are you headed?" The man shrugged as he climbed into the passenger seat, slamming the door behind him. "Anywhere but here, I guess." Carter gave a slight nod and pressed his foot down on the gas, sending the car speeding forward once more. They drove in silence for a few minutes, the hitchhiker staring out the window as the desert blurred by, the lights of distant towns barely visible on the horizon. "What's your name?" Carter asked, breaking the silence. "Mark," the hitchhiker replied without looking away from the window. "And you?" "Carter." Mark nodded, still staring out into the night. For a while, neither of them spoke, the tension hanging in the air like the oppressive heat outside. Carter's mind raced. He was sizing the man up, trying to figure out how to play this. Should he wait until they were farther into the desert? Should he strike now, while Mark was distracted? But then, Mark spoke again, his voice cutting through the silence like a knife. "You ever do anything you regret?" Carter's grip tightened on the wheel. "What do you mean?" Mark turned to face him, his eyes dark and hollow. "You know what I mean. You ever hurt someone?" For a moment, Carter considered lying, playing dumb. But something about Mark's tone, the way he asked the question, made him pause. There was something familiar in it, something that made his pulse quicken in a different way. "Maybe," Carter said carefully. "You." Mark smiled then, a slow, dangerous smile that sent a shiver down Carter's spine. "Maybe." The silence that followed was thick, the air in the car suddenly feeling too warm, too stifling. Carter's mind raced. Was Mark like him? Could it be possible? "I've done things," Mark said, his voice low, almost a whisper. "Things that would make most people sick. But you're not like most people. Are you, Carter?" Carter's heart was pounding now, adrenaline surging through his veins. "I guess not." Mark leaned back in his seat, his smile widening. "I knew at the moment you picked me up. You got that look, that feel about you. I've seen it before." Carter's mouth went dry. Was this real? Had he really just picked up another killer in the middle of the desert? Let me guess, Mark continued, his voice casual, as if they were discussing the weather. You like to pick them off the road, don't you? Hitchhikers, people who won't be missed. Easier that way. Carter didn't respond, but the look in his eyes must have given him away. Mark laughed, a dark, unsettling sound. I knew it. We're the same, you and me. For a moment, Carter didn't know how to react. He had always worked alone, always kept his dark urges hidden from the world. But now, sitting next to him in the passenger seat, was someone who understood. Someone who had done the same things he had. I've been doing this for years, Mark said, his tone conversational now, as if they were old friends. Started out small, like most of us do. But it gets bigger, doesn't it? The hunger, the need. Carter nodded, his throat tight. It's almost like a game, Mark continued. Seeing how long you can go, how far you can push it before someone catches on. They drove for hours like that, sharing stories, trading details of their kills, their methods. Carter found himself opening up in a way he had never done before, telling Mark about the first time he killed, about how easy it had been to make the bodies disappear out here in the desert. Mark, in turn, shared his own tales, laughing as he described the thrill of watching the life drain out of his victim's eyes. By the time they came across the second hitchhiker, it was as if they had known each other for years. She was standing on the side of the road, her thumb out, a backpack slung over one shoulder. She was young, in her early 20s maybe, with long dark hair and a look of desperation in her eyes. Carter slowed the car as they approached her, glancing over at Mark. Think she's another one? He asked, half joking. Mark shrugged. Only one way to find out. They pulled over, and the woman jogged up to the car, opening the back door and sliding into the seat behind them. Thanks for stopping, she said, her voice breathless. I've been out here for hours. No problem, Carter replied, glancing at her in the rearview mirror. Where are you headed? Anywhere but here, she said, echoing Mark's earlier words. Carter and Mark exchanged a glance. There was something off about her, something they couldn't quite put their finger on. But for now, they said nothing, driving in silence once more. The night stretched on, the miles slipping away beneath the tires, the desert around them growing darker and more foreboding. Carter could feel the tension in the car rising, a sense of unease settling over them. Something wasn't right. They pulled into a rest stop sometime after midnight, the small, dimly lit parking lot empty except for a few scattered vehicles. Carter parked the car near the restroom building, turning off the engine. I'll be right back, he said, glancing at Mark. Mark nodded, watching him as he stepped out of the car and disappeared into the shadows. Inside the restroom, Carter splashed cold water on his face, trying to shake the feeling of unease that had been growing since they picked up the woman. Something about her was wrong, but he couldn't quite figure out what it was. Maybe it was just paranoia, maybe he was imagining things. But still, he couldn't shake the feeling that they had made a mistake picking her up. When he returned to the car, Mark was gone. Carter's heart skipped a beat. He looked around, the parking lot eerily silent, the only sound the faint hum of the desert wind. Panic surged through him. Where had Mark gone? And where was the woman? Suddenly, a figure stepped out of the shadows, moving toward him with deliberate slowness. It was her, the woman, her face illuminated by the dim glow of the rest stoplights. Where's Mark? Carter demanded, his voice tight with fear. She smiled then, a slow, unsettling smile that sent a chill down his spine. He won't be coming back. Before Carter could react, she was on him, a blade flashing in the dim light. Pain exploded in his chest as the knife sank deep, and he stumbled backward, clutching at the wound. He tried to scream, but the sound was caught in his throat as the woman advanced, her eyes cold and predatory. Carter fell to the ground, the world around him spinning, the desert night, turning into a blur of pain and fear. He gasped for breath, his vision narrowing as blood poured from the wound in his chest. The woman stood over him, her knife gleaming in the faint light, a cruel smile twisting her lips. There was no hesitation in her movements, no flicker of doubt in her eyes. She had done this before, many times. Carter's mind raced, a flood of fragmented thoughts and regrets. How had this happened? How had he, Carter, the predator, become the prey? Just moments ago, he had felt invincible, sharing stories of his kills with Mark, confident in his power over life and death. Now, he lay on the ground, helpless, the life draining from him. The woman knelt beside him, her knife poised to strike again. "You really thought you were the only ones out here, didn't you?" she whispered, her voice soft and mocking. "Men like you always do. So confident, so sure of yourselves." Carter tried to speak, but the pain in his chest was too great. His breath came in ragged gasps, his body trembling as the blood pooled beneath him. The woman leaned in closer, her face inches from his, her eyes glittering with something dark and twisted. "I've been hunting men like you for years," she said, her voice low and dangerous. "You think you're so special, so clever. But you're not. You're just another monster in a world full of them. And I'm the one who cleans up the mess." Her words barely registered through the haze of agony that had consumed Carter. All he could focus on was the cold, hard reality that this was the end. He wasn't going to make it out of here. She was going to kill him, just as she had killed Mark. Mark! Carter's gaze flickered toward the shadows where Mark had disappeared. He hadn't even heard the struggle, hadn't known that his newfound companion had already met his end. A bitter realization settled over him. He had trusted Mark, just as he had trusted the wrong person in picking up this woman. The woman tilted her head, studying him with a twisted curiosity. "I bet you didn't see this coming, did you? You and your little friend thought you had the world figured out, that you could do whatever you wanted, take whoever you wanted. But you didn't count on me." She raised the knife again, her eyes gleaming with satisfaction. "I always find the ones like you. It's what I do." Carter's hand twitched, his fingers brushing against something hard and cold, the handle of a small knife he kept hidden in his boot. He had always kept it there just in case, though he had rarely needed it. Now, in this moment, it was his only chance. Summoning the last of his strength, he gripped the handle and swung the blade upward, aiming for the woman's throat. The motion was weak, unsteady, but it was enough to startle her. She stumbled back, the knife grazing her shoulder as she cursed and leapt to her feet. "You little," she hissed, her voice dripping with fury. Carter tried to push himself up, but his body wouldn't cooperate. His vision swam, darkness closing in around the edges. He could feel his life slipping away, every breath more labored than the last. The woman stood over him, her hand pressed to the shallow wound on her shoulder, her eyes burning with anger. "You're not going to make it," she snarled, her voice low and venomous. "But don't worry, I'll make sure your friend joins you soon enough." Carter's grip on his knife loosened as the strength drained from his body. He knew she was right. He wasn't going to make it. The world around him grew dimmer, the sounds of the desert fading into an eerie silence. His last thoughts were a mix of anger and regret, a bitter realization that in the end, he had been outmatched. The woman watched him for a moment longer, her expression cold and unreadable. Then, without another word, she turned and disappeared into the shadows, leaving Carter to bleed out alone in the vast emptiness of the desert. The rest stop was silent again, the only sound the faint rustle of the wind through the scrubby bushes. The woman moved quickly and efficiently, her footsteps quiet as she approached the car where Mark lay slumped in the front seat, his throat neatly slit. He hadn't even seen it coming. He had been too busy watching Carter's slow return from the restroom to notice the glint of her knife. She smiled to herself as she wiped the blood from her hands and pulled Mark's body from the car, dragging it into the shadows. This had been easier than she expected. Two predators, thinking they were untouchable, brought down in a single night. It was almost too perfect. Once the bodies were disposed of, she rifled through the car, taking anything of value, cash, weapons, anything that might come in handy for the road ahead. Then, with the same cold efficiency, she cleaned the blood from the interior and started the engine. As the car roared to life, she glanced at the empty road ahead, her eyes narrowing in thought. This was just the beginning. There would be more like them. There always were. And she would find them, one by one. The woman shifted the car into gear, her expression unreadable as she sped off into the desert night, the road stretching out before her like a dark, endless void. Out there in the dead of night, she was the hunter, and the desert belonged to her.
The rain poured down in relentless sheets, the storm turning the winding country road into a maze of slick asphalt and shadows. Jake squinted through the windshield, the wipers fighting a losing battle against the downpour. Beside him, Rachel stared out the window, her face pale, tense. It had been hours since they had passed another car, hours since they had seen anything but trees bending in the wind and lightning splitting the night sky. "We need to find shelter," Jake muttered, his knuckles white as he gripped the steering wheel. "I can barely see the road." Rachel didn't respond at first, just nodded absently. The oppressive weight of the storm pressed down on them, the sound of the rain hammering the car like the heartbeat of something immense and angry. She glanced at the gas gauge, almost empty. "There!" she exclaimed suddenly, pointing ahead. Through the sheets of rain, a flickering neon sign emerged like a beacon in the darkness. Vacancy. Jake felt a wave of relief. They could barely make out the outline of a small, isolated building nestled between the towering trees. It was an old two-story structure with peeling paint and a sagging roof. A large sign on the side read, "Clearwater Motel." They pulled into the empty gravel lot, the tires crunching over the loose stones. As the car came to a halt, the storm's fury seemed to intensify, as though trying to drive them away from the crumbling motel. But they had no choice. The gas was nearly gone, and there was no telling how far they would have to drive to find another shelter. Jake cut the engine, and for a moment, the world was reduced to the sound of the storm and their own breathing. "We don't have a choice," he said, glancing over at Rachel, whose unease was almost palpable. "Yeah," she whispered, but her eyes stayed locked on the building in front of them. There was something about it, something wrong. They grabbed their bags and dashed through the rain to the small office, the wind whipping around them, making every step a struggle. Inside, a dim light flickered overhead, casting eerie shadows on the worn linoleum floor. The air smelled stale, of mold and something faintly metallic. A bell sat on the counter, old and tarnished. Jake rang it twice, the sharp sound cutting through the oppressive silence. After a few moments, a man shuffled out from a back room. He was hunched, with thin gray hair that clung to his scalp in damp strands. His skin was a sickly pale, and his eyes had a dull, glassy sheen, as if he hadn't slept in years. "Room?" the man asked in a voice like dried leaves rustling in the wind. "Yeah, just for the night," Jake said, forcing a smile. "We're passing through and need a place to stay until the storm lets up." The man stared at them for a long moment, his gaze lingering on Rachel in a way that made her stomach churn. Finally, he nodded slowly, his movements almost mechanical. He handed Jake a key, room 12, and muttered something under his breath that neither of them could make out. "What was that?" Jake asked, his tone polite but firm. The man didn't answer. He just turned and shuffled back into the shadows, disappearing through a door marked private. Rachel shivered and tugged at Jake's arm. "Let's just get to the room," she whispered, her eyes darting around the dingy office. Room 12 was at the far end of the building, up a narrow staircase with creaking steps. The hallway was dimly lit, the old-fashioned sconces on the walls flickering weakly. The walls themselves were lined with old, faded wallpaper, peeling at the edges, giving the place an air of long-forgotten decay. When they entered the room, it wasn't much better. The bed was old and sagging, the carpet threadbare, and the single window was streaked with grime. A musty odor filled the air, as though the room hadn't been aired out in years. "Home sweet home," Jake said with a wry smile, trying to lighten the mood. But Rachel wasn't smiling. She stood near the door, her eyes scanning the room. "Something feels off," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Jake moved to her side and wrapped his arms around her. "It's just the storm and the fact that we're stuck in a creepy old motel. We'll be fine. We'll sleep, and in the morning, we'll get out of here." She nodded, though her body remained tense. They unpacked their bags and tried to settle in for the night, but as soon as the lights were off, the unease that had gripped Rachel only deepened. The storm howled outside, the wind rattling the window panes like someone, or something, was trying to get in. But it wasn't just the storm that made her skin crawl. there was something else, something in the walls. It started as a faint whisper, barely audible over the wind. At first, Rachel thought it was just her imagination, the result of too much tension and exhaustion. But then she heard it again, clearer this time. Voices. She sat up in bed, straining to listen. The whispering grew louder, more distinct, as though a crowd of people were murmuring just behind the thin walls. She couldn't make out the words, but there was something desperate, something angry about them. "Jake," she whispered, shaking his shoulder. "Do you hear that?" He groaned and rolled over. "Hear what?" "The voices, in the walls." Jake sat up, rubbing his eyes. He listened, and for a moment, there was nothing but the storm outside. Then he heard it too, a soft, rhythmic whispering. His eyes widened, and he turned to Rachel. "What the hell is that?" They both got out of bed, moving cautiously toward the walls, pressing their ears against the peeling wallpaper. The whispers were louder now, unmistakable, and they were coming from inside the walls. "Is there someone else staying here?" Rachel asked, her voice trembling. "Maybe next door." Jake shook his head. "No, the lot was empty when we pulled in. We're the only ones here." They stood in the center of the room, hearts racing, as the whispers grew more frantic, more insistent. Then, without warning, the sound of a woman screaming ripped through the air, followed by a chorus of anguished cries, echoing through the walls like a chorus of the damned. Rachel gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "We need to leave," she said, her voice shaking. "Now." Jake grabbed his keys, and they headed for the door. But as they reached it, the handle wouldn't turn. Jake tugged harder, but it was stuck, as though something or someone was holding it shut from the other side. "What the hell?" Jake muttered, pulling with all his strength, but the door remained firmly closed. The whispers in the walls grew louder, more urgent, and the temperature in the room plummeted. Rachel could see her breath now, fogging the air in front of her. The smell of decay and blood filled her nostrils, and she gagged. Suddenly, the walls themselves seemed to shudder, and from the cracks in the wallpaper, something began to seep through, a dark, viscous liquid that dripped onto the floor in thick crimson rivulets. "Jake," Rachel whispered, her voice barely audible over the growing cacophony of voices. "What is happening?" Jake didn't answer. His eyes were wide with terror as he backed away from the door, his hands shaking. "We're not alone here," he finally whispered. "There's something in this place." As they stood frozen in the center of the room, a new sound joined the whispers and screams, a low, guttural growl that seemed to reverberate through the very foundation of the building. Suddenly, the door burst open, slamming against the wall with a deafening crash. But the hallway outside wasn't empty. Standing in the doorway was a figure, tall and gaunt, its face pale and twisted, its eyes burning with a malevolent light. Behind it, shadowy shapes moved in the darkness, their forms indistinct, but filled with rage. Rachel screamed, and Jake grabbed her hand, pulling her toward the window. They had no choice. The thing in the doorway was coming closer, its footsteps slow and deliberate, its breath a ragged hiss. Jake smashed the window with a chair, and they clambered through the jagged frame, cutting their hands on the broken glass. The storm outside was just as fierce, but it was better than whatever was inside the motel. They ran through the rain-soaked parking lot, the wind whipping around them, but as they reached the car, Jake fumbled with the keys. His hands were shaking so badly he could barely get the key into the lock. Behind them, the thing from the motel was still coming, its pale figure barely visible through the sheets of rain. Finally, the car door opened, and they scrambled inside. Jake turned the key and the engine roared to life. He slammed the car into gear and peeled out of the lot, gravel spraying beneath the tires. As they sped down the road, the motel vanished into the storm, swallowed by the darkness. But the whispers remained, echoing in their minds, a constant reminder of the horror they had narrowly escaped. Hours later, they pulled into a gas station miles away, the storm finally abating. They sat in the car, breathing heavily, their clothes soaked, their bodies trembling. "Did that really happen?" Rachel whispered, her voice barely audible. Jake didn't answer. He just stared ahead, his eyes wide and haunted. And then, from somewhere deep inside the car, they heard it again. A whisper. They weren't alone. Not anymore.
The desert stretched endlessly in every direction, illuminated only by the pale glow of the moon. Ray's car cut through the stillness, headlights tracing a solitary path along the empty highway. He hadn't planned to drive this far tonight, but circumstances had pushed him deeper into the wilderness, away from any sign of civilization. The clock on his dashboard read 1:15 a.m., and the gas gauge was hovering dangerously close to empty. He hadn't seen another car, or even a flicker of light for miles. His stomach growled, hunger gnawing at him, and the prospect of finding food or fuel in this barren wasteland seemed increasingly remote. Just when he was about to give up hope, a faint glow appeared on the horizon, a neon sign blinking weakly in the distance. As he drew closer, Ray saw it was a diner, sitting beside a lonely gas pump. The neon letters flickered, spelling out Jack's Diner, casting a dull pink hue against the surrounding desert. With a sigh of relief, Ray pulled into the gravel parking lot, his tires crunching as he came to a stop. The place looked old, like it hadn't been updated in decades, but at this point, any sign of life was welcome. A gas pump stood beside the diner, an ancient relic from a bygone era, and Ray figured he could fill up after grabbing something to eat. He stepped out of the car, the cool desert air hitting his skin, and made his way to the door. The bell above the entrance jingled softly as he pushed it open, and immediately he was struck by the odd stillness inside. The diner was dimly lit, with just a few flickering bulbs hanging from the ceiling. A handful of patrons sat scattered around the room, each one hunched over their meals in silence. They didn't look up as Ray entered, their eyes downcast, their movements slow and deliberate. Ray approached the counter and took a seat on one of the cracked vinyl stools. Behind the counter stood a man, heavy-set, broad-shouldered, with a stained apron tied around his waist. His face was rough, his eyes sharp and dark beneath a greasy cap. "Coffee?" the cook asked, his voice gravelly, almost mechanical. "Yeah," Ray nodded. "And a cheeseburger if you've got it." The cook grunted and turned to the grill, his movements slow but practiced. Ray glanced around the room, taking in the other patrons. There was a businessman in a crisp suit, sitting near the window, completely out of place in this dusty, forgotten diner. An older woman, her head wrapped in a floral scarf, sat at a booth, her eyes fixed on the tabletop in front of her. A young couple sat in the far corner, not speaking to each other, their expressions distant. None of them looked at Ray. None of them moved except to sip their drinks or push food around their plates. An uneasy feeling settled in Ray's chest, but he shook it off. It was late, and everyone was probably just tired. He was too. The cook returned with his coffee, placing the chipped mug in front of Ray. "Where you headed?" the man asked, his tone flat. "Just passing through," Ray said, not really in the mood for small talk. "Got a long drive ahead." The cook nodded slowly, a strange smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "Long road at night. You ever hear music while you drive? Out there, in the middle of nowhere." Ray frowned. "Not really." The cook's smile grew, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Music's everywhere if you know how to listen. You should play something." He gestured toward the jukebox in the corner of the diner, a relic from a bygone era, its neon lights flickering faintly. "Go ahead, pick a song. It's on the house." Ray glanced at the jukebox, its presence looming strangely in the dim light. He wasn't in the mood for music, not after hours of driving. "Nah, I'm good," he said, trying to sound polite. The cook's smile faltered, a flicker of something darker passing across his face. "Small. Just one song. Help pass the time." Ray shook his head. "Maybe later. Just want to eat." The air in the diner grew thick, the silence oppressive. The other patrons, who had been so still before, shifted uneasily in their seats. Their eyes darted toward Ray, then quickly away, as if they were trying to warn him without speaking. The woman in the scarf caught Ray's eye for just a moment, her lips moving imperceptibly, forming silent words. "Don't!" Ray's skin prickled with unease. Something was wrong here, very wrong. The bell above the door jingled softly, but no one had entered or left. The shadows in the room seemed to lengthen, as if the walls were closing in. Then his phone vibrated in his pocket. Ray pulled it out, thankful for the distraction. There was a new message from an unknown number. "Don't play the jukebox. Whatever you do, don't play a song. He's not what he seems. Leave. Now." Ray stared at the screen, his heart pounding. He glanced around the room, but no one had moved. The woman with the scarf stared straight ahead, her hands trembling slightly. "Play a song," the cook repeated, his voice lower now, more insistent. Ray tensed, gripping his phone tightly. He didn't know what was happening, but every instinct screamed at him to get out of there. He shoved the phone back in his pocket and met the cook's gaze. No. The room seemed to darken, the light flickering above them. The other patrons froze, their faces pale, eyes wide with fear. The woman in the scarf mouthed the words again, "Leave." The cook's smile twisted into a snarl, his eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. "You're gonna play a song," he hissed, his voice no longer human. "Everyone does." Ray stood up, ready to leave, but the door to the diner was gone, replaced by a solid wall of darkness. The air grew heavy, thick with something malevolent. The other patrons, who had been sitting silently moments ago, flickered like ghosts, their forms warping and fading. The cook's figure distorted, his features growing monstrous. His skin darkened, cracked, as if burned by some unseen fire. His eyes blazed with an unnatural red light, and his teeth, sharp and jagged, gleamed in the flickering glow of the jukebox. "You're not leaving," the cook growled, his voice deep and echoing. "Not until you play." Ray's heart raced as the floor beneath him seemed to shift, the very walls of the diner bending and warping like a nightmare brought to life. The jukebox hummed behind him, its neon lights pulsing, beckoning him. He wasn't going to play. Whatever this thing was, whatever game it wanted him to play, he wasn't giving in. With a surge of adrenaline, Ray grabbed the nearest stool and swung it with all his strength. It collided with the jukebox, shattering the glass, sending sparks flying through the air. The machine sputtered and died, the lights going dark. The cook let out a furious roar, the sound shaking the diner to its core. The ground trembled beneath Ray's feet, and for a moment, everything seemed to freeze. Then in an instant, it was over. The cook was gone. The patrons were gone. The diner stood empty, abandoned, as if no one had been there in years. Dust coated the countertops. The booze were torn and decayed, and the neon sign outside flickered weakly before going dark. Ray stood in the eerie silence, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He didn't know what had just happened, but one thing was clear: he needed to get out of there. Without looking back, he pushed open the door, stepping into the cold night air. His car sat where he had left it, untouched. The gas pump, which had seemed ancient and rusted just moments ago, was now pristine, gleaming under the moonlight. His tank was full. Ray climbed into the car, his hands shaking as he gripped the steering wheel. He started the engine, pulled out of the parking lot, and sped down the highway, leaving the diner and whatever dark force had haunted it far behind. As the miles stretched out before him, the glow of Jack's diner faded into the night, disappearing into the desert like a forgotten dream.
The summer road trip had been planned for months. 4 friends, each looking forward to one last escape before the burdens of adulthood pulled them in different directions. There was Alex, the self-proclaimed planner and leader of the group; Ryan, the jokester who never took anything too seriously; Sarah, quiet but sharp, whose eyes often sparkled with mischief when you least expected it; and Emily, the sensitive one, always a little on edge, but loyal to the end. They piled into Alex's beat-up but reliable SUV, armed with snacks, music, and the exhilaration of the open road. Their destination, a secluded cabin deep in the mountains, far from the hustle of city life. The first few hours of the drive passed uneventfully. The highway stretched before them like a black ribbon cutting through the vast countryside. They laughed, sang along to the radio, and talked about their plans for the weekend, hiking, swimming, maybe even telling a few ghost stories by the campfire. The sun hung low in the sky, casting an orange glow over the horizon, and everything felt perfect. That is, until they missed the exit. "It was supposed to be right here," Alex said, squinting at the GPS. "I swear it said to take the next exit." "Maybe it's up ahead a bit," Emily suggested, though her voice held a nervous edge. "We've got time, right?" "Yeah, but we're kinda in the middle of nowhere," Ryan chimed in from the back seat. "I haven't seen another car in, like, an hour. How do we know we're even going the right way?" The atmosphere in the car shifted subtly, but Alex shrugged it off. "Relax, guys. Worst case, we turn around. It's not like we're lost, just a little off track." They kept driving. The sun dipped below the horizon, leaving the sky bruised purple and red. The road ahead seemed to stretch endlessly, flanked by dense woods on either side. After another 20 minutes, Alex's brow furrowed. "Okay, something's not right," he muttered. "We should have passed at least one exit by now." Emily stared out the window, her hands clutching her phone. "Can't you just use the GPS to find another route?" "I'm trying, but it's not loading. No signal out here." Alex's voice betrayed his growing frustration. Ryan leaned forward, peering through the windshield. "Wait, is that?" His voice trailed off as they all saw it, an exit ramp up ahead. Finally, Alex let out a relieved breath and took the turn, following the winding road off the highway. But when they reached the bottom of the ramp, instead of a new road, they were funneled right back onto the same highway. "What the hell?" Alex exclaimed, gripping the steering wheel tighter. "Did we just—" Sarah began, but no one finished the thought. The highway looked the same, exactly the same. Same trees, same road markings, same eerily empty expanse. "We must have gotten turned around somehow," Ryan said, though he didn't sound convinced. "That's impossible," Alex snapped. "There was only one way off, and this road doesn't even loop." They continued driving, but the further they went, the more the creeping sense of wrongness took hold. The trees on either side seemed darker, the shadows longer. Emily fiddled nervously with the radio dial, but all they could get was static. "Try calling someone," Ryan said, his usual humor replaced by an edge of anxiety. "No signal," Emily whispered, glancing at her phone. "None of us have service." Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. They saw another exit ramp ahead, and with a sense of growing dread, Alex took it, hoping against hope that this time it would lead them somewhere else. Anywhere else. It didn't. They were back on the same highway, the same stretch of empty road that seemed to mock them. The realization hit them all at once. They were trapped. Somehow, impossibly, they were stuck in a loop, driving the same endless road over and over again. "This can't be happening," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. "This isn't possible." "It's gotta be some kind of trick," Alex reasoned, though his voice wavered. "A glitch in the GPS or something. Maybe the road's under construction and—" "Alex, look!" Emily screamed, pointing out the window. They all turned to see it, a figure standing on the side of the road, illuminated briefly by the headlights as they sped past. It was a man, or at least it looked like one. His face was obscured by shadows, but his posture was unnatural, as if his limbs were too long, his head cocked at an odd angle. He didn't move as the car passed, just stood there, watching. "Did you see that?" Ryan yelled, his voice high with panic. "Yeah, I saw it," Alex replied, his knuckles white on the wheel. "I don't know what the hell that was, but I'm not stopping." They drove faster, the tension in the car thick and suffocating. Minutes passed, and then again the same figure appeared on the side of the road. This time, closer, and now they could see more. His clothes were ragged, his skin pale, almost translucent. His eyes, dark, empty sockets, seemed to follow them as they drove by. "Jesus Christ," Ryan shouted. How is he ahead of us?" No one had an answer. "Just keep driving," Sarah said, her voice trembling. But the figure wasn't the only thing wrong. The road itself seemed to change. The trees lining the highway became twisted and gnarled, their branches curling like claws reaching out to snatch them. The air inside the car grew stifling, thick with the smell of decay. "Something's wrong," Emily whispered, tears welling in her eyes. "Something's really wrong with this place." Another exit appeared, and with grim determination, Alex took it again. But this time, as they merged back onto the highway, they saw something different. A car, an old rusted sedan, sat abandoned on the side of the road, its windows smashed, the door hanging open. As they passed it, they saw what looked like dark stains on the seats, blood. "That wasn't there before," Sarah said, her voice barely audible. "Just keep driving," Alex repeated, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. But the longer they drove, the worse things became. The figure by the road appeared more frequently now, always closer, always watching. The trees bent unnaturally, their branches snapping in the wind even though the air was still. And the road itself, was it narrowing? Twisting? It felt like the world around them was unraveling, reality itself breaking apart. And then they heard it. A faint, rhythmic sound at first, barely discernible over the hum of the engine. But it grew louder. A thumping, a pounding, like footsteps, but heavier, coming from the roof of the car. "What is that?" Emily cried, clutching her seatbelt. Alex floored the gas, but the thumping grew louder, more insistent. Something was on top of the car. Ryan unbuckled his seatbelt and leaned up to look through the sunroof. "Oh God," he whispered. There, crouched on the roof, was the figure, its face pressed against the glass, grinning. A twisted, grotesque smile that stretched too wide, its teeth jagged and broken. "Drive faster," Ryan screamed. The car lurched forward, the engine roaring, as Alex pushed it to its limits. But no matter how fast they went, the figure remained, its eyes, empty pits, boring into them, its hands scraping against the glass. And then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure was gone. The car sped down the highway, the sound of the engine the only thing breaking the silence. But they were still trapped. The road still looped endlessly, and now something was wrong with the sky. The stars above seemed to flicker, dimming and brightening in irregular patterns. The moon, once full, now appeared distorted, as if it were melting, oozing down into the horizon. "I can't do this anymore," Emily sobbed. "We have to stop. Please, we have to stop." But where could they stop? There was nowhere to go. No towns, no gas stations, not even a place to turn off the road. Just the highway and the oppressive, suffocating darkness. And then they saw it. Up ahead, blocking the road, was the same car they had seen before, the rusted sedan, now parked directly in their path, its headlights flickering on and off. Alex slammed on the brakes, skidding to a stop just in time to avoid hitting it. "What the hell?" he shouted, looking around frantically. But the car was empty, or so it seemed. Ryan opened his door, stepping out onto the pavement. "We need to check it out. Maybe there's something in there that can help." "Are you insane?" Sarah snapped. "We're not getting out of this car." But Ryan was already walking toward the sedan, his hand gripping the flashlight from the glove compartment. The beam of light cut through the darkness as he approached the vehicle. The rest of them watched in tense silence, every breath shallow, every heartbeat loud in their ears. Ryan reached the car and peered inside. His scream echoed through the night. Alex leapt out of the SUV, running toward his friend. He reached the car just as Ryan stumbled back, his face pale, his eyes wide with terror. Inside the sedan, slumped against the steering wheel, was a body, or what was left of one. Its skin was shriveled, pulled tight against bone, and its eyes, hollow, empty sockets, stared out into the night. But that wasn't what had made Ryan scream. The body. It was wearing Ryan's clothes. The realization hit them like a punch to the gut. This wasn't just some random corpse. It was him. Dead, decayed, as if he had been sitting there for years. Alex grabbed Ryan's arm, pulling him away from the car. "We have to go, now." They ran back to the SUV, throwing themselves inside and slamming the doors shut. Alex floored the gas again, the tires screeching as they sped down the road. But it didn't matter, because no matter how fast they drove, no matter how many turns they took, the road never ended. The sky grew darker, the air thicker, the world around them twisting into something unrecognizable. And the figure, the thing that had been following them, was no longer standing on the side of the road. It was inside the car. They didn't see it at first, but one by one, they felt its presence. The air grew colder, the darkness deeper. And then, from the back seat, a voice. "You'll never leave." They turned, but it was too late. The figure was there, sitting between Sarah and Emily, its face inches from theirs, its mouth twisted into that same grotesque grin. And then, in a voice that sounded like the wind howling through dead trees, it whispered, "You've always been here." The car swerved, the headlights flickering, and then everything went black. When the highway patrol found the SUV the next morning, it was parked neatly on the side of the road. The engine was dead, the doors locked, and inside, sitting in the front seats, were 4 bodies, their faces frozen in expressions of sheer terror. The officers never did figure out what happened to them. But sometimes, late at night, drivers on that same stretch of highway report seeing a figure standing by the road. Tall, pale, with empty eyes and a twisted smile. Waiting.
It was a little past midnight, and Jeremy Fisher was tired. Too tired, really, for the long, lonely drive he was on. His eyelids were growing heavier by the minute, and the faint hum of his sedan's engine, combined with the monotony of the deserted highway, was lulling him dangerously close to sleep. The radio played a soft, forgettable tune, but the crackling static suggested he was far from any major town or city. He needed to stop soon, if not for rest, then at least for some gas to power him through the last leg of his journey. As if on cue, a flicker of light appeared in the distance. Jeremy squinted through the windshield, and as he got closer, the flickering light resolved into the glowing sign of an old, isolated gas station. The neon sign buzzed weakly, half the letters burnt out so that it read gas tat on, the words stuttering to life and then dimming again. Jeremy pulled into the gravelly parking lot. The station was small and looked like it had seen better days, probably a relic from a time when this highway wasn't as desolate. A single pump stood at the center, rusted and weathered, and the small convenience store attached to it had a few dim lights on inside. There were no other cars in sight, and the surrounding area was suffocated by the dark, thick woods. Perfect, Jeremy muttered to himself, more in an effort to stay awake than out of any genuine excitement. He parked his car next to the pump and stepped out into the cool night air. The gas pump's handle was sticky as he picked it up, the nozzle creaking as if it hadn't been used in ages. Jeremy glanced toward the convenience store, debating whether he should grab a coffee or just pay and leave. The tiredness that had been gnawing at him all night returned, sharper this time, like a nagging reminder of how long he'd been on the road. As he turned back toward his car, his eyes caught something strange, a flash in the station's window. The glass reflected the dim, yellow light from the store's interior, but there was something off about it. For a split second, Jeremy thought he saw someone standing in the reflection, a woman, her face pale and twisted in terror. She was mouthing something, eyes wide with panic, as if she were begging for help. Jeremy spun around, his heart pounding, expecting to see her standing behind him. But there was no one. The parking lot was empty, the station silent except for the faint hum of the neon sign overhead. He turned back to the window, heart still racing. The reflection was normal again, just the distorted image of his own car and the gas station behind him. He shook his head, trying to dispel the feeling that had crept up his spine, that chill of something being terribly wrong. "You're just tired," he whispered to himself, gripping the pump handle tighter. But as he looked closer at the window, there was again a figure just at the edge of the glass. This time it wasn't the woman. It was a man running, his face smeared with blood. He looked frantic, turning his head as if something were chasing him. And then, right before Jeremy's eyes, the man vanished. 1 second, he was sprinting across the reflection. The next, he was simply gone. Jeremy felt his stomach twist. He stepped closer to the window, almost pressing his face against the glass, hoping, praying that it was just some strange optical illusion. His breath fogged up the window as he squinted to see if there was any logical explanation. But as the mist cleared, the reflection changed again. Now there was a scene of pure carnage. 2 people stood in the middle of the gas station, where his car was parked just moments ago. One was the woman he had seen earlier, her clothes torn and stained with dark, wet patches. The other was the man, who lay crumpled on the ground, gasping for air. Something else, something inhuman, was standing over him. It had no distinct shape, just a blur of shadows with elongated limbs, like a predator emerging from the darkest parts of the forest. The woman screamed soundlessly in the reflection, her face contorting as the shadowy figure lunged toward her. Jeremy stumbled back, his hand covering his mouth in disbelief. He spun around to look at the parking lot, but there was nothing, just his car, the gas pump, and the desolate road stretching out into the void of the night. The reflection was showing him something that wasn't there. Or was it? His breathing quickened as he tried to rationalize what he was seeing. It wasn't real. It couldn't be real. His mind was playing tricks on him. Maybe he was more exhausted than he realized. Maybe he was hallucinating. But even as the thoughts formed, the reflection shifted again. This time, it showed Jeremy himself. He stood at the pump, just as he was now, but something was behind him, something that looked like the same shapeless entity from before, its limbs curling and reaching toward him, ready to strike. Jeremy's heart dropped. He whirled around, certain that he would come face to face with whatever it was. But again, there was nothing. The lot remained empty, silent, but the growing sense of dread gnawed at him, making every shadow seem like a lurking menace. The pump clicked, signaling that his tank was full, but Jeremy barely heard it. His hands were shaking as he removed the nozzle and replaced it on the pump. Every muscle in his body screamed for him to get in the car and leave, but something held him in place, some awful curiosity, some terrible need to understand what was happening. He turned back to the window one last time. This time, the reflection showed him a series of rapid images. People, strangers, were being attacked one after another. A man walking his dog, a woman loading groceries into her car, a truck driver stepping out of his rig. Each one was there for only a moment before they were struck down by the same shadowy figure, their faces frozen in silent screams. And then the reflection showed him something worse. It showed Jeremy, running, bleeding, gasping for air as the figure pursued him. His reflection stumbled and fell, the creature looming over him, its arms stretching impossibly wide, preparing to consume him. Jeremy backed away from the window, his mind screaming at him to run, to get out of there as fast as he could. He fumbled with his keys, nearly dropping them as he scrambled to unlock his car. His hands were shaking so badly that he could barely manage to shove the key into the ignition. Just as the engine roared to life, something thudded against the passenger window. Jeremy screamed, jerking his head to the side. A face was pressed against the glass, a woman's face, her eyes wide with terror, her mouth moving soundlessly as if she were begging for help. The woman from the reflection. Jeremy's heart pounded in his chest, and for a moment, he was paralyzed, unable to process what was happening. Then, the woman was gone, yanked violently away from the car as if pulled by some unseen force. Jeremy slammed his foot on the gas, the tires screeching as he sped away from the station, his eyes flicking between the road and the rearview mirror. For a split second, he saw her again, standing in the middle of the road, her hand outstretched, eyes pleading. But then she vanished, swallowed by the darkness behind him. Jeremy drove faster, the engine whining as he pushed it to its limits. The dark road stretched endlessly before him, and for a while, he thought he had escaped. But as the minutes dragged on, the air in the car grew colder, a suffocating chill that made his breath mist in the cabin. Something was wrong. Jeremy glanced at the rearview mirror, and his blood turned to ice. The shadowy figure from the reflection was sitting in the back seat, its featureless face turned toward him, its limbs unnaturally long and twisted. It didn't move, didn't make a sound, just sat there watching him, waiting, Jeremy's hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles turned white. He wanted to scream, wanted to jump out of the car and run, but he couldn't. The shadows seemed to grow, its presence filling the car, pressing down on him like a physical weight. Then, in a voice that was not quite a voice, more like the sound of rustling leaves mixed with distant whispers, it spoke.
You're next.
Jeremy's scream finally broke free as the car swerved violently off the road, crashing through the underbrush. The last thing he saw before everything went black was the reflection in the windshield, the reflection of himself slumped over the wheel, blood dripping from his forehead, and a shadow, now sitting in the driver's seat, grinning without a mouth. And then there was only darkness. When the highway patrol found the wreck the next morning, the car was empty. The doors were locked from the inside, the gas tank full, and the keys still in the ignition. There was no sign of Jeremy Fisher and no footprints leading away from the car. Just the cold, still air of the deserted highway and the faint flickering of the gas station's neon sign, which buzzed weakly in the distance.
It started as an ordinary trip. Aaron and Matt had been dreaming of a cross-country road trip for months, something spontaneous and adventurous before life became too predictable. Matt had just bought a sleek, brand-new electric car, a marvel of modern technology that made him feel like they were traveling with the future itself. It was quiet, smooth, and energy efficient. No more gas stations or dirty fumes, just pure, eco-friendly adventure. The plan was simple: drive from their suburban home in Illinois to the West Coast, taking in the vast landscapes, scenic byways, and quirky roadside attractions along the way. They'd planned meticulously, charting their route with precision, making sure to note all the charging stations where they could recharge the electric car's battery. It all seemed foolproof. Their first few days were perfect. The car performed as advertised, the skies were clear, and the excitement of the open road filled them with a carefree joy they hadn't felt in years. They took turns driving, sharing stories and laughing, admiring the countryside as it passed by like scenes from a dream. It was all going according to plan until the third night. They had decided to push farther that evening, venturing off the main highways and onto a stretch of rural road that cut through dense forests. Aaron, in the passenger seat, noticed the sky beginning to darken earlier than usual, with thick clouds obscuring the setting sun. "Looks like we might get some rain," she said, glancing at the weather app on her phone. Matt nodded, keeping his eyes on the road, though he felt a slight unease in his stomach. The road was unusually empty and the trees pressed close, their branches forming jagged shadows across the asphalt. As the battery indicator on the car dipped lower, Matt slowed the car and pulled up the map on the dashboard screen. "There's a charging station about 20 miles up the road. We'll stop there, grab some food, and wait out the rain," he said, trying to sound confident, though the growing darkness made him feel strangely isolated. The rain came in torrents soon after, the windshield wipers fighting to keep up. The narrow road became slick and reflective, and the car's headlights illuminated only a few yards ahead. The occasional passing truck sent waves of water splashing over the hood, and Matt tightened his grip on the steering wheel. "There," Aaron said, pointing as the charging station appeared on the side of the road. It was a small, lonely outpost, with just 2 charging ports and a dimly lit service station that looked abandoned. There were no other cars in sight. Matt pulled in and parked next to one of the charging ports, relieved to have arrived before the battery had completely drained. He stepped out into the rain, pulling his jacket tighter around himself as he reached for the charging cable. Just as he plugged it into the car, the entire station went dark. A sudden, jarring silence fell over the area as every light blinked out, leaving only the dull patter of rain on metal and concrete. Matt froze, his heart racing. Is that a power outage? Erin asked through the cracked window, her voice uncertain. I don't know, Matt replied, pulling his phone from his pocket. The screen was dark, dead. Phone's out too. He tried not to panic, but a gnawing sense of dread crept in. No power meant no charge for the car. No phone service meant no way to call for help. He got back in the car, shaking the rain from his jacket. Erin was already trying her own phone, but it too was lifeless. That's weird, she muttered. Do you think it's just here, or... Matt looked out the windshield, scanning the empty road and the dense woods beyond. Maybe it's the storm? A blackout or something. Erin nodded, though she was clearly nervous. Should we wait it out, or should we try to find help? Let's give it a few minutes. The power might come back. They sat in silence, listening to the rain tap against the roof, feeling the oppressive weight of the darkened forest around them. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours, and still the charging station remained dead. Then, from somewhere deep in the woods, came a low guttural sound. Erin tensed. Did you hear that? Matt nodded slowly, his eyes scanning the black trees. Yeah, it's probably an animal, maybe a deer or something. The sound came again, louder this time, closer. It wasn't a deer, it was, too, deliberate. Like something heavy, moving slowly, almost as if it were circling them. A sudden rustling from the underbrush caught Erin's attention as she whipped her head around toward the passenger side window. Matt, what is that? Matt leaned forward, squinting into the darkness, trying to make out shapes beyond the beams of the car's headlights. His breath caught in his throat as he saw something, just a flicker of movement, a shadow slipping between the trees. I don't know, he whispered, trying to sound calm, but the panic rising in his chest was undeniable. The strange noise from the forest grew louder. It wasn't just one sound anymore, but several, multiple, unnerving, almost human-sounding groans mixed with the snapping of branches. Erin reached over and gripped Matt's arm tightly. We need to go. Matt nodded. He turned the car's ignition, hoping to at least use the remaining battery to get back to the main road, but the car remained silent. Come on, he muttered, flipping the switch again and again. Come on. Nothing. The car's dead, Erin whispered, her voice trembling. Matt glanced around the darkened charging station, then back toward the woods. Maybe we can make it to the service station, he said, nodding toward the small building a few yards away. It was completely dark, but it looked like the only possible shelter. Are you crazy? Erin shot back. There's something out there, Matt. We can't leave the car. We can't just sit here either, Matt snapped. He regretted his tone immediately, but the fear was bubbling up uncontrollably now. The groaning noises grew louder, closer. Erin's eyes were wide with terror. Matt, it's getting closer. Matt gritted his teeth and grabbed a flashlight from the glove compartment. We go together. Stay close, all right? It's probably just an animal. But deep down, he didn't believe his own words. They stepped out of the car, the rain drizzling down more lightly now, but enough to make everything feel damp and cold. The flashlight flickered as Matt clicked it on, casting long, sharp shadows on the pavement. Together they ran toward the service station, the sound of their footsteps muffled by the rain. The building was old, with peeling paint and grimy windows, but it had a heavy door that looked like it could offer some protection. As they reached the door, Matt jiggled the handle. Locked. Great, he muttered, shining the flashlight around, looking for another way in. Erin was breathing heavily, her eyes darting toward the trees as the noises grew even closer. Then, from the edge of the woods, something stepped into the light, a dark, hulking shape, almost human, but not quite. Oh my God, Erin whispered, backing up. Matt spun around, his flashlight beam catching the figure for just a moment. It was tall, too tall, its limbs long and distorted. Its eyes glowed faintly, reflecting the dim light. But the most terrifying part was its face, or what passed for one, a twisted, featureless mask of pale skin. The creature moved slowly, deliberately, as if it knew they had nowhere to go. Matt's heart pounded in his chest. "Get inside," he shouted, slamming his shoulder against the door. With a loud crack, it gave way, and they tumbled into the service station, slamming the door shut behind them. They stood in the pitch black, their breaths ragged, listening for any sign of the creature outside. For a moment, there was only silence, save for the rain. Then, a scratching sound. It was faint at first, but growing louder. Something was outside, right on the other side of the door, scraping its nails or claws against the wood. Matt held the flashlight in one trembling hand, pointing it at the door, as if that small beam of light could hold back whatever was out there. "What do we do?" Erin whispered, her voice barely audible. Matt shook his head, unable to speak. The scratching continued, slow and deliberate, like it was toying with them. Then, without warning, it stopped. The sudden silence was almost worse. They stood frozen, waiting for whatever would come next. But nothing happened. Minutes passed, then hours. The rain slowed to a light drizzle, and the night dragged on in agonizing quiet. Erin sat against the wall, her knees drawn to her chest, while Matt kept the flashlight aimed at the door, afraid to let it out of his sight. Eventually, exhaustion overtook them both, and they drifted in and out of a restless sleep. When the first light of dawn crept through the dirty windows, Matt cautiously stood and peered outside. The woods were still, shrouded in early morning mist, but there was no sign of the creature. "We need to leave," he whispered, shaking Erin awake. They stepped outside, the air cold and damp. The charging station was still dead, and their phones remained useless. But the creature was gone. Together they began walking down the road, leaving the dead car in the haunted woods behind, hoping, praying, that they'd find help before whatever had stalked them in the night returned. But as they disappeared down the empty road, neither of them noticed the faint, dark shapes that moved within the trees, following just out of sight. The woods, it seemed, were not done with them yet.